Happy Tuesday, everyone. Slowly coming into the hall. It's a kind of strange dynamic. We open the doors and everyone straight in, but we're here for our weekly political Geekfest, as I love to call it, where we have a chance to look over the weekly Guardian Essential Report and have a chat about all things political. I'm really happy to have both here in spirit and in video personage my partner in cephalological crime, Katharine Murphy. Before we have a chat to Katharine, I better go through the basics, which are to recognise that we're all on traditional land wherever we are. I'm on the land of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation. And I know that wherever you are, you pay respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise the land that we are all on has never been ceded. For those that are new, and I see a lot of familiar faces, so maybe we don't even need to go through this anymore. This is an experiment in keeping together that's becoming a little bit more sophisticated week by week. But the idea of Australia at home is a place to share ideas in a respectful way and think through what comes next. There are three things you need to know if you're new. Firstly, that you, on this beautiful platform Zoom, you can go to the top right of your screen and go to gallery view. And if you turn your video on, which you do at the bottom left of your screen, everyone can see each other, which makes us all feel closer together rather than just being sort of pods at the end of some sort of process. The second thing is that if you open the chat, which you go to the bottom right of the screen and open that up, you can introduce yourself and make comments as we go. Call us out when you think we're talking rubbish, and put in some questions, and we'll call you up to the stage at the appropriate time. And the final thing is that we video these and place them on the site for those that miss out. So if you do come up, I'm sure you're all going to keep it nice and stick to the spirit of Australia at home. So on that note, I'll introduce Katharine back to the stage. 2 weeks working on her essay, and then 1 week caught in a strange technical world where, you know, we could hear you, but we couldn't quite see you, but you're back, and great to have you. You are in the booth at the Guardian offices in Federal Parliament, and how's it going?
I am. Yeah, all right. Pretty good, actually. Yes, thank you to everybody who persisted last week through technical snafus. We kind of got there in the end, but that was all a bit hairy. But anyway, nice to be back with the tech working today. Yeah, it's fairly quiet here today, although there's plenty of bits and pieces going on. But I think the Prime Minister's back in Sydney at the moment for a couple of days. He's based himself here throughout this whole COVID crisis. So things do just feel a little bit quieter today than they have in the last few weeks. But anyway, there's plenty of mischief to be had and plenty of things to be getting on with.
And of course, it's a notable day. Today is the anniversary of the worst hangover I ever had in my life, which happened the morning after the night that Scott Morrison won the election. And I had too much wine and much too much cheese. So you wrote a great piece this week about the 12 months since the election. And I think your unifying sort of thesis was that Morrison has shown that he's a leader that learns on the job. I don't want to reduce it down, but and it seems a weird world to be giving anyone a rating. And I know we're not polling on the beauty contest at the moment. But what is your take on Morrison and the journey he's been on since I had my hangover 12 months ago?
Well, it's been interesting. Obviously, I don't think, if we distill it right down, I don't think Morrison really found his feet until we hit the COVID crisis. Obviously, everyone will remember the bushfires was a complete disaster. And prior to that, he really struggled to sort of land what the government's agenda was. And that sort of stems back to the primary point, which is I think probably he was the only person who thought they would win the election. Most people in the government thought they would not. So when you win an election you don't expect to win, it can take you a little while to find your stride. So that's pretty obvious. In terms of the learning point, Peter, I think that's interesting because not all prime ministers can learn. Some prime ministers are fixed when they come to the job. They're just different iterations of the same product. This guy can learn from things that have not worked well in the past, and also, can do things that you wouldn't expect. The sort of main thing that you wouldn't have expected, I suppose, is the sort of the non-tribal approach Morrison has taken to managing the COVID crisis. Now, I mean, that's a generalisation, because you can find lots of culture war actually in the COVID response if you go looking for it. But as a general proposition, he basically kind of did a complete pivot on stimulus, opened a line of dialogue with Sally McManus and other players whom he wouldn't have given the time of day to prior to the COVID crisis. Again, that's interesting, because not all leaders would adapt in a crisis. Some would be rigorously and relentlessly themselves. But it kind of points to this conundrum about Morrison. This is why I find him quite a difficult study. He's kind of the man who wasn't there in many respects. It's sort of like he's ubiquitous, and he's everywhere because he's the Prime Minister, and he's got a sort of a persona that he presents to the public, sort of suburban dad, baseball cap, that sort of character. But I find him I find it very difficult to get to the core of who and what Morrison is. And it's sort of that, perhaps that flexibility in a strange way helped him during the crisis, helped him do what really needed to be done. Now, whether or not the piece sort of got into that, but it also, it's very open-ended in the sense that he can certainly learn, he can certainly adapt, but I genuinely think this guy's still trying to work out what sort of Prime Minister he wants to be. I don't think he knows that yet.
A lot of us on the progressive side sort of took quite joy in the whole Scotty from marketing thing. Is that the right way to look at him? Is it all veneer and nothing underneath, or do you think that's selling him short?
It's not all veneer, but I just express it slightly differently, Peter. It's just this issue that I've got where the sort of more I watch him, the less I know. He's sort of, he's both ubiquitous, he's both everywhere, and yet he's hidden in plain sight as well. I don't know, I think maybe at his core he's quite a private person, that there is a core of himself that is just for himself. Possibly it's that. He's tribal but not ideological, which is different and interesting. He's very, very difficult to get your mitts on.
And what I think the great unknown is, he's gone through this period where I've always said he's done the opposite of his natural instincts. He's governed collaboratively with the states, with stakeholders, as you said, and also run a Keynesian agenda through an emergency, and it's really worked. So do you then internalize that and say, I've worked out how to govern, or is it, I've had to do these things to keep the show together and now I'm going to go back to who I really am? And I think that's a bit of an unknown still, because I know the pressure to go back to, traditional conservative government will be incredibly strong on him. But, and maybe this is a segue to dive into the first lot of numbers, man, it's been working for him, doing this idea of governing as a team. And, it has led him to a terrific position in terms of the public's support for and approval of the way the government's going. So we are now at 73% support, which is a combination, 32% very good, 41% quite good. As I think we've said in the past, that support still crosses lines. And while and we'll move into this in a sec, I get the sense that maybe the sort of the national positivity towards the health response is going to enter a new phase as we emerge. It's still incredibly strong endorsement from people we poll every week.
Yes, yeah, well, it has worked, but that point you make is correct, Peter. It's unclear how long this sort of mode of governing and governance will survive on the other side of the crisis, and we are starting to see the various pressures being brought to bear on Morrison sort of reverting to a coalition type, if that makes sense. So, look, I think we've said a few times in this forum over the last few weeks, like the hard stuff for Morrison is all ahead of him, even though that's a funny thing to say, because literally these guys have been managing, the biggest sort of health and economic crisis that many of us have ever seen. So they will think that they've worked enormously hard and it's been enormously difficult up until now, and that is of course true. But what is really difficult is the dismount, is how you come off the other side of the period that we have been in now. And we can see the public has endorsed, like sort of cutting it through to the simplest level, right? That the public has endorsed this mode of governing and governance. If you then shapeshift again and you project a different mode of governing and governance, you remove some of the income support, you go down the path of fiscal consolidation. Coupled with that, you've got a probable weakness in the economy for quite a period of time. Those are very, very difficult conditions for governments to navigate.
Yeah, it's kind of true, isn't it? You look back to the GFC when Kevin Rudd was showering everyone with money, like high approval, but the wind back is a different sort of politics. And I think, we're about to see that again. Do you think there are discussions within the government about whether the rapid wind back is the default? Is it where they want to go and it will be how far they can go? Or are there alternate voices inside the government saying, let's hold this model of collaborative decision-making and supporting those in need a little bit longer?
I think there's different views around the government. I think there's certainly a strong view in sort of more ideological quarters of the backbench that Liberal governments shouldn't be paying people not to work. That's just a basic ideological principle, and there'll be pressure on Morrison to wind that back as quickly as humanly possible, and from some quarters of the backbench. But I think what's sort of in play now, and this is what we saw in the last parliamentary sitting week, with supports like the JobKeeper payment, for example, Labor has opened a conversation with the government about how you might transition that payment or taper it, basically, how you move on to the next phase of proceedings. Now, and the government has basically shown some willingness to engage on that, as they did a couple of times previously as the stimulus was being rolled out. So I suspect that's kind of where the action's going to be over the next little bit. Despite the fact that Morrison is clearly softening up the public for the withdrawal of these COVID supports, right? He keeps saying that over and over again. This can't go on in perpetuity. I think Morrison is fundamentally a political animal and a pragmatist. So the idea that you would suddenly pull out the life raft, that's not really his form. A more ideological prime minister kind of relates back to what I was saying a moment ago. A more sort of stridently ideological prime minister may do that. This guy is flexible and pragmatic, so I think he'll do what he thinks works or works best in the circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing that is potentially happening here too. And I got a little bit exercised this on social media, which I should never do when I haven't read the whole article properly. The other day, where the Daily Mail had reported that Morrison was talking about people addicted to welfare. And it was kind of taken out of context, but it was kind of the vibe that we can't get addicted to this. And what struck me was that he runs a real risk of repudiating his own success if he moves too fast. And it seems to me the opportunity for Labor, if he does that, is actually to own the successful response. So Labor says, this is what's worked, keeping the community together. Why has he walked away from this? And so there is a risk in changing gear, or as you say, dismounting. He's looked beautiful on the pony, but if he gets back into the mud because it's been raining a bit, maybe it's not quite so attractive.
No, exactly. This is the toughest bit. This over the next 2-3 months to come, this is the toughest thing for Morrison politically. I'm not talking about the crisis per se. I'm talking about his political challenge.
And I'm interested in how you see them trying to win the public persuasion on this. Like, the default for a Conservative government will be just to drop a whole bunch of thought leadership to the Australian and cheap headlines to News Limited. But can they get away with just running almost like trying to change people's reality, or do they have to be a little bit more nuanced in your view?
No, well, look, I think obviously, we'll see a bit of that. We will see a bit of sound the trumpet. Here are my magnificent, beneficent thought leadership. We will see that, but it's not the, that's you have to win the argument with people in the middle. You can speak to your, you can speak to your base, you can speak to your rusted ons, but at the end of the day, you have to win the debate in the middle. So, I think that the really tricky thing for Morrison will be, in a way, what we've seen is a bit of a trade-off, Peter, I think, right? He's sort of signalling to the more ideological types on the backbench, this is finite. This income support and other things is finite. We will navigate a way out of that, which sort of contains breakouts in his own side that would be quite large, I think, in the absence of that kind of signalling. And the trade-off for those people, those sort of more ideological people in the government, will be a period of reform, which Morrison is kind of also signalling, right? That we've got to boost productivity, we've got to look at the labour market, we've got to do all these sorts of things. So that's sort of getting into traditional liberal shibboleth type territory. But the real difficulty for him, I think, is going to be the economy. Look, I mean, if this is a V-shaped recovery, if we go down and then we whiz back up relatively, sharp and fast, well, you can have some of these reform conversations, although I would argue not too many of them simultaneously. I would say there's a great danger in injecting too many thoughts, right, into the mix and losing everybody in the process. But I think if it's a V-shaped recovery, maybe you can have the reform conversation that the sound the trumpet crew love. But if the economy's patchy, if people don't make it back into work seamlessly, if we've got a extended period of fragile kind of job security, low wage growth, all of that sort of stuff, which we sort of had a taste of prior to the pandemic hitting, then that's not a very fertile environment for, hey, I've got a beaut idea, let's deregulate the labour market. Yeah. Doesn't tend to work, right? Like in the real world, I'm saying. So anyway, we've just got to see how that one pans out.
All right, we might just crack on a bit because we'll come back to jobs because it's one of the areas we have polled on this week. Quickly, state governments doing just as well as the feds. Queensland down 4, but if you're going into an election with 66% thinking you've done a good job, you're not quite reaching for the breaker glass yet, are you?
No, that's pretty solid. I mean, it is interestingly, it is not as strong as the other states, but you would, if you were Anastasia Palaszczuk facing an election, the idea that you hadn't screwed up a major crisis is obviously beneficial to you politically. Yeah,
and by the same token, it's highly contested. So the 66% is in a highly contested partisan environment. I think you'd have to say Victoria is quite ham-fistedly partisan in its politics at the moment, and the Victorian opposition just seems to be shooting itself in the foot. Whereas I think in New South Wales, WA and South Australia, it's much more still that bipartisanship, or at least, the opposition trying to find a way into the debate. I know that they've spent a fair bit of energy trying to create the crisis around the Ruby Princess in New South Wales, which I'm not sure if it's really bitten. And, you know, New South Wales is still at 70%.
Well, it's I think what happened, just quickly on that point, obviously in that Ruby Princess week, which was a critical week in the management of the crisis, the mismanagement that happened in New South Wales that week was very quickly superseded by Berejiklian and Andrews pushing for the lockdowns of non-essential services, right? So I think, you know, I think those leaders were genuinely motivated by, you know, trying to reduce the body count associated with this virus, but also politically, Berejiklian executed a pretty major pivot that week, which sort of, I think, has probably, I mean, I'm speculating, Peter, but I suspect given her a little bit of insulation because she's been seen to be on the right side of the arguments.
Correct. One more before we come up for air and have a bit of a chat with our crew. Easing restrictions, you know, 67% are now looking at a timeline. I don't feel like the government is a lot, well, if different states are going at different paces, but I think the general proposition that with the numbers we're seeing, I thought it was interesting on the Insiders this week, they've scrapped the curve because there is no curve, it's a flat line now.
Yes.
That people are ready to see an easing up. Now, I think, you know, we are all being softened up to expect there will be a cost to that, but 25% say it's too early, soon to be easing restrictions. I might, John is there, and our head geek, John Remington, who's on the call too. Is that age determined at all, that 25%, or is that pretty much across the board? We haven't unmuted John. Anyway, you talk.
Sorry, Peter. Yes, I was looking for the mute button there. There's slight differences, but nothing where we would say we're confident of a change between the ages there. So when we're talking about thinking it's too soon to age, that ranges from 19% amongst those who are 18 to 34 up to 30% amongst those who are 55 to.
So a little bit, but not.
A little bit there.
But
yeah, it's not a huge amount. I think when you're talking with the state results as well, it's also good to note that those figures that we've compared to were last week, and what we've seen week on week is a gradual change. Particularly for New South Wales and Queensland, they started at a really low point a month ago, where their rating of the handling was down in the 50%. So whilst all the other states have remained about the same, Queensland and New South Wales, they've really picked up their game.
But it does feel like we're entering the next phase, doesn't it, Katharine? And it kind of feels that, you know, as the season is changing, so is, you know, the stage of this bizarre little journey we're all on.
Yeah, except of course that we're about to head into winter.
I know.
And I think, look, I think in general terms, people are willing to have the experiment. Definitely, you can see it just from, you know, people out and about. If you're getting out and about, people want to have a go at resuming normal life. But I think everybody from Brendan Murphy, who said a week ago that, you know, the prospect of a second wave was what kept him up at night. You know, right through, if you go and see your GP at the moment, they'll sort of fret with you about the possibility of a second wave. Everybody's got it in the back of their mind, but everybody is also keen, I think, to experiment with how, you know, how normal you can be in conditions where you're likely living with a virus that you can't cure for an indeterminate period of time.
We might go to a couple of questions from the team in the call. Is Sarah there? Yeah, there you are.
Hi. Yeah, I just wondered, I mean, we all know that the government's approach to climate change has been incredibly hypocritical in terms of having vested interests, but they have, with hats off to them, approach this crisis with a view to the scientific evidence. Do you think there's any chance that the government would change their approach with regard to the climate crisis?
You want me to
Time?
take
Yeah,
that?
go for it. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah. Look, radically, change their climate approach radically, I think is a low chance that will happen. Incrementally, I think it's possible. Now, obviously, it won't be to the extent that the science says is necessary. Obviously, it won't be radical, in their terms, radical. But I think even before the pandemic hit, the government was trying to experiment. Hello, Sarah's little person. How cute. Hello. Even before the pandemic, the government was trying to work out how it could regroup on climate policy in a way that worked well. In a way, if I'm being blunt, it didn't blow up the Liberal and National parties. And I think we'll probably see some experimentation around that still, but I would be holding a very, very low hope that we're going to see radical change.
An interesting comment from iPad, who hasn't put their name up properly, but I'll just throw it into the mix. I think he's done a remarkable job. This about Morrison. I've had to change my opinion about old ScoMo. If he can continue to learn as he goes, he could surprise everyone. Do we really have to pigeonhole him into a specific mode of governance? I guess that was more pointing to that notion of collaborative. I don't know if that's a specific mode of governance or just a successful way of going about his business. But I'll call Kamal up as well, if you are unmuted.
Yes,
Hello.
I am now unmuted. Thank you very much. Hello. Thank you very much for that. Just one quick comment. I think there's a difference between governance and leadership. So it's an interesting concept. My question was got to do with the Labor Party, actually. From opposition, I think there's a degree of ease to criticise and to comment. But had the Labor Party won the last election, how do you think they would have been handling this? And how would their agenda have been affected?
Well, very fundamentally, their agenda would have been affected, very profoundly and fundamentally. Like, the idea of sort of introducing, changes to negative gearing right at the moment, sort of increasing taxes right at the moment. Obviously, that would have been extremely difficult for the Labor Party to manage. There's also the sort of perversity in the Australian system too, which the GFC was the sort of archetypal example, where, Labor tend to manage economic crises or not, but let's take the GFC as an example where we did avoid recession, unlike most of the rest of the world, and yet they get not a lot of credit for doing so. So I think they would have adopted similar approaches, in my view, to the management of the crisis as the government has, although I suspect, JobKeeper, casuals would have got it, temporary workers would have got it, various other groups who were excluded from the government's model, university workforces, for example, deliberately excluded. I don't think a Labor government would have done that. So I think that leads you to conclude that perhaps the fiscal stimulus would have been more expensive. But I also think, Morrison has got a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Adulation is a ridiculous word. That's way overstated. But Morrison has sort of fundamentally changed the personality of his government and been applauded for doing it. If I can see circumstances where Labor would have had to basically jettison its entire pre-election platform
And be accused of backflips.
And would have sailed into the management of a crisis where I think it would have spent more money comparatively. I don't imagine the universal response to that would have been applause in some of the quarters where the government is getting applause for this radical shapeshift. Now, maybe I'm being cynical. I don't think so, because I'm not a cynical person. I just think it would have been much more difficult for Labor to manage this crisis at quite a few levels.
Look, I think a Labor government. Sorry, can you come in a sec? I think a Labor government could have run the same basic agenda, because it's kind of a Labor agenda that's being run at the moment, and they would have been absolutely smashed by both the coalition opposition and the Murdoch media. Like, I think if Labor was doing this, it would be a very different external environment.
Well, that is a question. Sorry, Kamal, I know you do want to get a word in, but I'll just say this very quickly. This is one of the major things in this crisis. Like, sometimes in a crisis, things happen, right? And they're obvious and we report them. Sometimes in a crisis, things don't happen, and they're also really important. And I would add the bipartisanship, largely, that we have seen during this crisis is a really underrated component of the management of the crisis, the return of trust in politics, sort of tepid return of trust in politics, all of those sorts of things, right? If, Albanese has done the country a service by keeping the temperature collaborative, cooling the whole sort of ecosystem down. Now, not all opposition leaders would have chosen to do that.
Sorry, Kamal, you rounded out if you like there, mate.
Oh no! Look, this is you brought up the point I was going to ask actually, and how would a Liberal opposition have handled this, and they wouldn't, I think, perhaps allowed the government to get away with as much as they had. I think they would have been a lot more vocal in their opposition. So you picked up on that, and that's what I was going to ask again. So
excellent. Okay, look, let's go into the second lot of questions, which are kind of fresh ones we've asked this week. And I'll premise by saying I feel like we are moving into a new season, as I said a little bit earlier, and that winter is now coming. And there's two sets of numbers here that kind of look separate, and I might end up creating a tenuous straw man that you can all tear down. But the first one is around jobs. So this time we divided our sample into three groups: those who are still in employment, those that are unemployed due to COVID-19, and those that are long-term unemployed. On 1,000 of a sample, these aren't huge samples, but they're enough to sort of get a bit of a feel. And the one that really stood out to me, and I know you led your report on the Essential Report today with, was that 1 in 10 of those that have lost their jobs don't think they'll find a way back into paid work. And another 36% saying it's going to take a long time. That's brutal, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of, and I agree that these are small samples, but it rings true. It rings true with people's, with our learned experience of what happens in previous recessions. That is what happens. There's a cohort of people in recessions who sadly do never work again. And it's also, your sort of instinct says that the recovery will be patchy. That's kind of what instinct says. So people are kind of right, I think, to be looking ahead with a certain degree of, trepidation is probably too strong a word, but anxiety about what lies ahead. Because we're not in a position with this thing, whatever happens, like that, I suppose unless a vaccine appears tomorrow that can be rolled out to the entire population of the world in 5.5 minutes, we're not going to snap back, as Morrison once was fond of saying. That's not going to be what happens. There's going to be a tail associated with this crisis, and people are, particularly people who have had the experience of losing their jobs in the opening weeks of this crisis, of course they're going to be worried about whether or not they will return to the labour force and how long it might take them to do that.
Yeah, if you look at these numbers, 46% of those newly unemployed, and it's pretty similar amount of those that are long-term unemployed, just don't see anything bright around the corner anytime soon. So that speaks to a couple of things. I think one of them is the need to engineer the recovery. Like, left to its own devices, people are feeling very much on their own. And then on the right-hand column, those still in employment, there's not going to be a pay rise or a promotion anytime soon. And, they do see cost of living going up. So this creates a set of conditions where, trepidation may not be too strong a word. And, economists know this better than pollsters, but confidence breeds confidence economics, Leon, I think, you know, the problem you're getting here is if you're in that mindset, you're not spending money, you're not going out and getting, and like there's this sense that people are just going to go back into the world, and it doesn't feel to me that this suggests that's going to happen.
Well, they might for a period of time because of, you know, pent up frustration. Everybody might hit the Westfield, you know, because the alternative is sort of slowly going crazy in your lounge room. But so maybe there's some pent up activity that we'll see. But in these conditions, if you are living, you know, with job insecurity, you're not going to be crazy. You're not going to be spending any money that you don't need to spend. You're going to be trying to pay down debt where you can. These are just rational responses to, you know, external events. So, and Morrison, you know, has been talking openly, candidly about how important the confidence element of that equation is, and how you go about engendering confidence is critically important to the recovery and the duration of the recovery.
Another quick slide. I think there's one on, I've lost control of my screen. I thought this was kind of interesting, just throwing, people obviously have a more positive, or say they have a more positive view of healthcare. I don't know who the 4% are that don't, but also a little bit, so there's a little bit more empathy sort of bubbling away in the community around those that are struggling. I think, particularly, I think it's going to be really interesting, and where, you know, at the end of this call, I'm going into a discussion with ACOS about planning how they start thinking through any campaign to maintain the job seeker payments anywhere near where they are now. But I do think there is now a sense more people having lived through the experience of employment precariousness, and maybe some of those old tropes about, you know, people willfully being out of work will fade away, and will probably, you know, and it's a horrible place to go, but the sense of people that are there through no fault of their own, as if people are ever responsible for their for being in the jobless queues. But they're kind of vaguely heartening. But unless you've got anything to say on how nice we've become, I'll go into the last bit of the polling, because I think it leads to a really interesting discussion. And we kind of started it flippantly, but I think there's something real here that talks to some policy stuff. There's been a whole bunch. Well, we call them conspiracy theories. I'll just say in the question, we didn't call them conspiracy theories. We talked about contested theories. So 77% of people believe the outbreak in China is actually worse than the official stats show, which is kind of, I wouldn't put that in conspiracy theory. I think that's more in geopolitical analysis and maybe a bit of an analysis of state media. But then you get to the Wuhan lab theory, and it's kind of evenly split amongst those that think it's true or not. And then you get to some of the crazier conspiracy theories, you know, it's been exaggerated by the media. Again, maybe that's a value thing, 20%, that's not a huge number. And then we get into the sort of the Bill Gates and the 5G, and there's, you know, 12 to 13%. They tend to be, we'll go to John for the fun facts in a sec on that. But so there's a whole bunch of reasons and ideas floating around. But the bit that struck me when I looked at this was, if you line up the economic dislocation and the willingness to almost blame China, that kind of feels to me like a brew for real populist politics if we're not really, really careful. And while we've been having these high and mighty foreign policy debates around China and their accountability at the elite level, I'm just wondering whether you see a threat in that translating into something that's a little bit baser down the line, and whether that could end up being what informs the next wave of politics in the country.
Well, it's possible. And I think it was last week, Peter, wasn't it? Did we poll on the temporary workers questions last week? So, you know, look, it stands to reason that a profound economic shock will trigger a resurgent nativism, nationalism. That's what history tells us. That's what happens. You would not be surprised to see similar sentiments really start to kind of burble away here. And, you know, in fairness to people too, obviously I think a lot of the debate about China is conducted in very cartoonish terms in this country, but obviously the regime did not cover itself in glory with the management of this crisis and with its subsequent positioning either, right? Just like to give that its due. So look, yes, I think nationalism is going to be one of the features. There'll be a couple of focal points to it. In a policy sense, there's a whole debate which is starting around the issue of sovereign capability, which will be some of the front end of kind of patriotic or nationalist sentiment. Be interesting to see how Morrison handles that. And this is like sort of going back to where we started in this conversation about he's a learner, he's a shapeshifter. Well, you can sort of divide him into a couple of chapters. Like before COVID, like I saw, you know, Morrison kind of flirt with whether a version of Trumpism could work in the Australian context. Now he's not Trump. I mean, people say he is, but he isn't. He's quite a distance removed from Trump, but he flirted with his own version of that. And certainly in this crisis, he's backed right away from that and he's tried on a different suit, which is the collaboration, evidence-based, calm, softly suit. So he's tried that on. When I said at the start of the conversation, I don't know that this guy's worked out what Prime Minister he wants to be. That's part of it. I've seen him try on several suits. I don't know which suit he's going to be left with at the end of the day. But again, as Morrison also knows, just a sort of slight counterpoint to the rise of nativism, Morrison is well aware, and it is at the foreground of his messaging, that a country like Australia is very dependent on trade and relationships with the rest of the world for the economic prosperity of citizens. We can't just wall off forever because that is not the destination to national wealth. So I don't quite know how he's going to tune all these different elements of the debate, but that's what we'll be looking at in some shape or form over the next 12 months, I think.
So what's your sense of what was the motivator on going first on the inquiry into China? Like was it just to hedge your bets and have something a bit Trumpy in the back pocket in case you need it?
No. I think genuinely, to give Morrison his due, look, you can criticise him for going out of the blocks before he'd built a constituency of support for that proposal. That is probably foolish in a diplomatic lens, right? That he probably should have worked out whether anyone would support us before crashing through that barrier. But no, genuinely, I believe this, from what I'm observing up close. No, I think the desire was really to get to the bottom of what happened here, because it's quite important, like setting aside any sort of political lens, it's quite important that we do that to the extent that we're able to, because this will not be the last pandemic that we have to deal with. I think genuinely the government wanted to try and set up a process where there would be some fact finding, and it didn't have a lot of confidence in the World Health Organization in order to do that fact finding. Now, like I say, on the diplomatic front, I don't think he should have raced out the gate before doing the numbers, as it were. That's kind of stupid, and it alienated China, and that has escalated the kind of war of words we're seeing now. But in fairness to the government, I don't think that's an unreasonable proposition for the Australian government to adopt. What happened here? How did this start? How was it transferred? Because all of those lessons are going to be pretty important for us in, God forbid, managing the next one.
The chat's happening. If you want to start thinking about any questions you want us to put in the field for next week, I think John's probably writing up the questions for next week as we speak. So John, what are we looking at next week? And maybe I know we had a couple of fun facts about the conspiracy theory that I forgot to point to you to as well.
Yeah, so next week, I think, given the focus on China, we'll have some questions about the trade things which have happened today and recently, and our relationship with China. That's something that we have looked at in the past, so we might be able to get some tracking results for that. Again, just looking at kind of, as Katharine said, the transition out, so transitioning of JobKeeper, perhaps of the childcare scheme. We could be looking at that as well, and perhaps something on the leaders as well, and what their attributes are. During the bushfires earlier in the year, we did see a big shift in the way people perceived Morrison, particularly.
Oh, he's good in a crisis. Numbers collapsed, didn't they? So it'll be interesting. I suspect they might come up a little bit.
Mm-hmm. So we might look at that as well.
Yeah, good one.
Yeah, in terms of the contested theories or conspiracy theories, we did see a shift by a difference in age there. So generally, younger people were more open or more trusting of those statements. It's probably worth countering that by saying we had this on a 5-point scale of definitely true and probably true. And the difference we're seeing is people saying it's more probably true rather than thinking they're definitely true of the involvement of Bill Gates or anti-vaccinations.
Do you have any questions you want for next week, Katharine? Or anything jumping
No, I
out
think
that we're curious about?
No, I think they're the sort of obvious ones. I think, yeah, trying to get a sense, I don't know how we structure those questions, but whether people are open to the tapering down of income support. I think it's pretty important to start to get a line on that, a line on sentiment about that. And maybe there's some questions that we could construct around that. Do people think it's okay for it to be finite? Do people, think it should taper down? Do people think that perhaps as one of the trade-offs of it tapering down, more people could be included? Casuals that were excluded in the first round, for example, or other groups. I think it'd be useful to try and start to track a line on that stuff, because that's where things are going to move.
Bill Ronalds just made a really interesting point, which is so many things are being missed because of the emphasis on the economy and the pandemic. There was a little bit of an attempt for Labor this week or last week to reheat sports rorts. I don't know.
It was a pretty attempt, Peter. I think it was a pretty tepid attempt. I don't know that their heart was in it. More's the point, and more's the pity. It's just. Look, I can't vouch for whether there's a public appetite for this to be pursued or not. It's not. That's sort of not what motivates my endeavours or the endeavours of my team. We just try and pursue things if we think that something bad's happened, and we think someone ought to get to the bottom of it. I think Labor's sort of been reluctant to engage in face-offs about other issues, sports grants, other things, because everybody is cognizant of the fact that the country has benefited from a sort of dialing down of the temperature. Everyone's feeling better about institutions and politics because everybody's not beating each other up behind the bike shed every 5 minutes. But I mean, look, sports grants is really important. We still have no clear answer to the question about whether or not the government acted lawfully. I think that's quite a significant thing to not have an answer to. I don't really understand why, people aren't, very, very focused on this. I really don't. But anyway, maybe it'll return.
So
maybe interest will return.
What is the threshold for raising issue? Does any issue exist outside this context at the moment? Or is it all
I think people have been, and we, looking through a Guardian lens, obviously, we know what people are reading in terms of the content that we are providing every day. I think people were, over the last few months, were very, very preoccupied by COVID. There was massive readership around that. Everybody very, very interested in factual information about the pandemic, about income support, about what the government was doing, about what restrictions were, all of that sort of stuff. Huge huge attention in the country around those issues. Now, I think people are still pretty interested in all that stuff, but we're seeing more normalcy start to assert itself, not only in real life, but also in terms of what people are interested in. There's sort of it's a return to a mix of things.
Had a sort of a I don't know if it's tongue in cheek or straight up, but I'll give you the floor, Terry Ulick.
Hi, Peter.
Hey there.
Hi, Catherine. I asked that question, is tepid the new Labor? And the reason why I asked that is that as an opposition, you really do need to start setting the agenda, no matter how difficult it is, given the crisis, let alone the Murdoch press. At some point, it does require imagination and creativity as an opposition to start to create an agenda. Then it requires endless finessing of the strategy. And I'm not getting that coming through. It's almost like we'll just raise a couple of things here and there. We'll do what we have to do. Then we'll drop off and let it roll, because we don't want to be upsetting the cohabitation that seems to be the prevailing orthodoxy at the moment. Have you got a comment on that?
Look, I think broadly that's right. They have been conflict averse, but I actually view that as a positive, Terry, in the sense that I think Labor has not had a lot of credit for doing that, but I think some of the changes that they were able to implement through the way to income support and other measures were pretty important interventions, and they succeeded in the interventions by not drawing a lot of heat and attention to it, right? So, and I think you're right. Obviously, if Labor intends to, try and win the next election, they obviously have to give people a reason to vote for them, rather than just sort of endlessly slipstream it, behind the government and hope that someone thinks that they're nicer than Morrison or something, that is obviously not a strategy. But at the moment, I think it's genuinely difficult for Labor because you don't, I think, right at the moment, want to draw attention to yourself for its own sake, because the ways that you would be doing that would be sort of, I suppose you could have more upmarket forms of attention seeking, but would be predominantly attention seeking. And we have seen, certainly in Peter's work, just this return of, again, I've been overstating, using words that are overstatements a bit today, but there is this kind of sense of relief in the polity, or, that governments have been more or less competent. People have stopped decking each other behind the bus shed, all of that stuff, right? And so I think Labor has to be quite careful at the moment about how and when you start to dial up, because you can attract a lot of attention to yourself, but in so doing that, you can also increase your negatives significantly.
Yeah. We've kind of seen that in Victoria, haven't we?
I just think, there's an art to, it's sort of like a submarine, it's sort of, there's an art to when you resurface. I don't know exactly when you resurface, but I think Peter said before that it's shaping the recovery. It's shaping, how the economy kind of comes out on the other side of this, and how other issues come out on the other side of that. There's opportunities for Labor there, but there's also costs and risks at the moment.
Yeah, I think the political context is around the reconstruction, and there was very little to be gained in we're moving from the health crisis to the economic crisis, and that's where there has to be a political contest, and I think we'll start seeing that a lot more. Now, I wanted to squeeze one more question in because it was a beauty from Meg, if she's there, before we do our niceties and wish everyone on their way. Are you there, Meg? We'll give it the awkward 2 seconds. Otherwise, I'll just read it out. But it was about.
Yeah.
Sorry, you there, Meg, or not?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Hello. So my question was about intergenerational debt, although I'd rather talk about intergeneration inequality. I mean, I've got two young people in my house, one starting uni, the other's finishing year 12. I am worried about their future. But when I hear them lectured to about you are the ones who are going to have to pay back the debt, I just think, no, they're being misled. I mean, unemployment is the concern for them. And I just have the feeling that if the government just switched to let's focus on unemployment, the debt really isn't the issue. So is it not time to be focused on getting Australians back into work, if that means a job guarantee, if it means public spending on projects, social housing, renewable energy projects? Imagine if we could address climate change and unemployment together.
Well, Meg, I agree. I agree in large part, but I don't agree with the proposition that debt per se is not an issue. At a certain point, debt is an issue. But at this, because obviously we need to be able to afford the social services that improve, equality of opportunities for people. These are, like it's fine at the moment. Money's cheap. Governments can borrow. The Reserve Bank has made that point. There's also opportunity in the recovery, and some of you guys might be interested. I spoke to Jim Chalmers, Labor's Shadow Treasurer over the weekend on my podcast about debt and about other issues in which we kind of ran around a few thoughts and about what happens with debt into the future. And there's a whole discussion around economists about whether or not, given debt is cheap, whether if you can sort of bring back economic growth in this recovery, whether the economy grows faster than the rate at which the debt grows, right? And then as you say, Meg, then we don't have a problem. We do have a problem if the debt grows faster than the economy grows, because I care about funding public services. And if you care about funding public services, you've got to care about the capacity to pay. We're not America. We can't just borrow endlessly. I mean, America doesn't care about debt because America doesn't need to care about debt. We're not in that position. But in terms of, like, you're talking about, inclusive growth and a recovery based on inclusive growth and all of that sort of stuff implicitly in your comments. And of course that's right. I've got kids the same age as yours. I've got a kid in year 12 and my girl's just finished university and has graduated into a labour market where she is not going to get a job, in her profession. It is really deeply horrible for us as parents and for them. And I remember the 1991 recession myself. That's when I graduated from university and tried to get a job. These experiences in these economic upheavals change your mindset for life. They really impact the way you see the world and your priorities. Yeah. So, like, I totally agree that we've got to, try and come back at this thing by growing the economy for everyone.
If I may just follow up, I mean, my concern is that young people are being talked to about this debt, really to kind of soften them up for the fact that, we'll be able to told, oh, well, look, we can't afford these kind of social programs that might help you. We can't afford to be doing things for you because we've got to focus on the debt. And what I'm saying is not that we can ignore debt, but that the way to get rid of debt is to focus on the number that really matters, which is unemployment, because you're not going to get rid of debt by stopping spending and by pulling back. The way you're going to get rid of debt is to grow the economy, get people working, get people spending, get people contributing. So if you focus on the debt, you'll stay there. If you
at 1 minute to 2, that's probably a can of worms we can't open now. But I do promise that we are going to do a generational issue in the coming weeks. But it is time for us all to get back to our lives, whatever form that may take. And thank you, Katharine, for giving us an hour of your time in the middle of the busiest time for journalists ever. Thank you for everyone for coming in. Thank you all for your questions. we're keeping this project going at least through June, because we've got a whole schedule booked in now because people want to be part of this, which is great. Tomorrow we've got a really interesting one, which is Osman Faruqi, who's a young influential journalist, I guess, speaking with his mum, who's a Green Senator, Marine Faruqi, and that should be a really interesting talk, looking at the experience of Ramadan and their faith. On Thursday, we're part of the National Day of Action for the NTU to save our universities, and Friday, Daniel Stone's talking to a bunch of comedians about laughing through coronavirus, including Mark Humphreys, who's fantastic, from 7:30. So a really good program still coming up. So make this your home every week. Thanks to those who sponsor us, particularly Guardian Australia, who gives us time and space, Principal Co, and our new supporters, Morris Blackburn, who are going to be running a session in a couple of weeks as well. So thanks everyone for being part of it today. We'll see you again tomorrow. Fill out the feedback form and go well. See ya.
See you guys.